We are live.
All right, well, I will go ahead and get us started then. I just want to start by saying thank you to all of you for participating in this working group with us on these new pathways and the entry points as we continue to work on this model and build towards these pilot programs. My name is Madison Edwards, and I'm one of the co-chairs for this group. I am currently an 8th grade social studies teacher with the North Carolina Cyber Academy. I'm in my 8th year of teaching, and I'm excited to be here with you for this meeting and our February meeting to kind of work through some of these things, again, as we continue to shift and make changes in education in North Carolina. So I just want to start off by giving everyone a chance to introduce themselves and kind of tell us a little bit of where you come from, what your position is, the district, university, or the office that you work for. And I'll let Dr. Holland introduce herself, who's first on our list. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Marcy Holland, and I want to echo Madison's sincere thanks for your willingness to join us in this work. I'm battling the end of a cold, so I'm not going to talk much, but I'm a retiree, spent over 27 years in public education before retiring. Currently still sit on Pepsi as a commission member, and I'm serving as a consultant with a couple of different school districts in the state, currently in HR. So Madison, I'll let you lead us through this. Thank you very much for doing that.
Absolutely. So we'll just go in order. Dr. Evans, I guess the members on the list on the next slide. And give everyone just a chance, an opportunity to introduce yourself if you are here with us today. And again, if you just want to share with us where you're coming from, your position, the school district or the university that you're with, and we'll kind of go from there. So where's the full list?
Would you like me to call the names of participants?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm having a weird trying to see.
Allison Winsler.
Hi there, I'm Allison Winsler, and I am the Director of Pathway to Practice, which is an EPP, which is a collaboration between NC State and UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Andrea Burton.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Burton. I am the Assistant Director for Human Resources for Moore County Schools.
Thank you. Brenda Berg.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Brenda Berg. I'm the CEO of Best NC. I represent the business community on education issues.
Thank you. Erin Horn.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Erin Horn. I'm the Assistant Dean for Professional Education and Accreditation at NC State University here in Raleigh.
Thank you. Melba Spooner.
Hi, everyone. Melba Spooner, and I am Dean in the Wright College of Education at Appalachian State University. Thank you very much. Enjoy working with you.
Thank you. Scott Rhodes.
Scott Rhodes, Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources, former middle school and high school principal here in Henderson County.
Thank you. Catherine Truitt.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. My name's Catherine Truitt, and I am the State Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Thank you. And I'll hand it back over to you, Madison.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So we are going to kind of jump right in here. You should have received this PowerPoint from Dr. Evans, and hopefully you've had a chance to kind of look through that. We do have some obvious norms here for you to look at again as we're working through. We only have two meetings together to kind of get through this information, and we're hoping to be able to do that in a positive manner, and that gives everyone the ability to kind of get in their opinions and comments on some of the things that we're going to be looking at. So if you want to take a second and kind of look at those. All right, if we want to go to, So our work group is really going to focus on, there are 6 topics here that we are going to look at, but there are 3 of them, the bolded 3 in the middle, that we feel like need the most attention. So we're going to, you received a document in addition to the PowerPoint that has kind of an outline with several different topics and several different pieces of information that we're going to look at. So some of the things we're going to be focusing on is the articulation of the entry points, the credentials of a person entering at each entry point of the platform, the professional progression, and the evidence that's used to move between each of these entry points and to maintain your license within the level that you're in. And then how and what evidence will be used and necessary to progress to your next level, and then the supports necessary for each person to engage in the successful professional progression. So there's a lot of pieces that we will be looking at that focus on how educators will be able to move from one license level to the next. And then the last item on the list is compensation for these licenses. So kind of looking at that base salary at the entry level and then the progression from there. So we are going to look specifically at those 3 bolded topics there, and then as conversation comes up surrounding the 3 that are italicized, we can discuss that as well. So Dr. Evans put a link in the a link in the comment section to a Google Drive, and you should be able to access this on New Pathways Entry Points. There's a working document there. You should be able to go ahead and add in comments. You should have the ability to make suggestions. So we're going to kind of use this as a working document through our meetings so that as things come up, you can highlight and leave comments on specific topics that you might have questions on as we're going through and discussing each point. So I just want to make sure, is everyone able to access those documents? Okay, so as long as you're able to kind of go in there and ask questions, we'll just go ahead and kind of get started. So the first piece on here is the articulation, or essentially just the wording of the entry points and what each of these are kind of titled as. And so when we look at each of the levels, we have the apprentice license, the license 1, which is a teacher in residency, license 2, teacher in residency, knowledge and skill development, license 3, teacher in residency, knowledge and skill advancement. The license 4 is given the expert teacher title, and then a license 4 CE is an advanced teacher with the focus on the classroom excellence piece. And then a license 4 AL is the advanced teacher in adult leadership. So I just want to take a second and see if there are any comments or anything like that in that section of the wording.
Hi, everybody. This is Erin. I was just curious for license 1 and 2. it has affiliation with an EPP and PSU that guides routing. Will there be, like, what does that mean for guides routing? Like, does that mean guides routing through the different levels or paperwork, licensure route? Like, what does that, is there a definition of what that means somewhere?
Where are you reading that, Aaron?
Under number 2, credentials of the person entering at each point. Is that where we were in that section, correct? Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
I think Kim's highlighting it there. Under B and C at both, they both have affiliation with an EPP and PSU that guides routing.
Dr. Evans, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that that is basically the partnership that is guiding the individual through the license into the next level of license. Am I wrong?
That's correct.
Okay. So it's similar to the partnership we have now.
Right. Okay. So it is about kind of helping them develop a plan to get from license 1 to license 2.
Yes, ma'am.
Got it. Thank you.
And making sure that they're affiliated with that teacher prep program as well.
Got it.
So in this credentials section, where it really, we pulled from the document and in order to put each of those requirements within there. So you can see with the apprentice license, it's someone who has their associate's degree or 60 credit hours towards a baccalaureate degree. And so each license level is kind of progressing to add a little bit more. During the license 1, like we just discussed, you've got relevant content hours in addition to being affiliated with the EPP. If you have a CTE license or you're working towards your CTE license, it's a little bit different because you're able to use those 3 years of relevant work experience. And then license 2, you are still having that same affiliation as well as the license 1 requirements. License 3 builds upon that because this is where you start having your requirements to demonstrate effectiveness. And then license 4 builds upon that as well as you're progressing through, you know, the number of years of teaching experience that an educator has had. Questions about those A through E? I'll take a second there because F and G are a little bit different.
Sorry,
this is Andrea, and I wanted to know what, how would effectiveness be measured?
So that's one of the things that we will be discussing in this work group. That's one of the things that is on our list to kind of talk about. And it's so when we look at section 3, it's got that wording in there, evidence of successful practice. So some of the things that we're looking at right now might include the micro-credentials provided by the PSU if they've met the standards set by the Board of Education, effectiveness of 3 to 5 years could be EVOS tools, it could be student learning documents, peer reviews, or potentially principal observation, teacher observation tools. And so that's where we're at now, and that is one of the things that is on our list to discuss. So
I'm curious, sorry, again, about between B and C, because B does have the affiliation with an EPP and a PSU that guides routing, and then C has affiliation plus license 1. So how is license 2 different from license 1? Do they have to demonstrate any progress towards that? How are B and C different, I guess, is my question.
So each of the license levels have a year attachment designated to them. So you can only be in a license 1 for up to 3. So you have up to 3 years to complete the 18 hours to be affiliated with an EPP and then the PSU. And then once you've met those requirements, that's where you would move into the license level 2. So license level, the B license level 1, it gives you those 3 years to essentially meet those requirements to then move into a license level 2.
So I guess I'm confused because it says that those are the credentials of the person entering at that point. And so I thought that for a license 1 to enter at a license 1, you would have to have the bachelor's degree or higher, 18 hours of the relevant content, affiliation to guide routing, and if you have a CTE area, 3 years of or if you're a CTE relevant. And then, so the difference, I guess, yeah, I thought that was what was required to enter at license 1. So how would license 2 be differentiated from license 1? Or do I just have to spend my 3 years at license 1? And then if I don't go to license 3, then I have another 3 years at a license 2 to meet license 3?
Ms. Edwards, this is Tom Tomberlin. Do you mind if I jump in here for a second?
Thanks, Tom.
Absolutely, Tom. Go ahead.
So there's another subcommittee working on the measures of effectiveness. So this goes back to Andrea Burton's question of how do we define effectiveness? And there's another group that is working on what those measures are. So this group is how you enter. So if you were a license, and one of the things they're working with on those measures is to say, can we establish a level of can we look at these measures that we're proposing to use for the establishment of the license and say, is there a basic or foundational level of understanding or demonstration of those skills? I think that group has largely landed on the fact that these should all be grounded in the INTASC standards. So if you wanted to use Praxis and NTPA to say, I've met the standards, I've met proficiency on the INTASC standards, or if you wanted to use some other instrument that's being developed to say, I met the standard on that. What would need to be established is, to your point, Dr. Horn, what is the distinction between coming in at a level 1? What are those foundational skills that we think you have to have in order to work as a co-teacher with a license 4 teacher? And then for a license 2, what is the basic level of understanding that you would need to function autonomously with, let's say, 5 hours of oversight by an advanced teacher? So that's the kind of progression that needs to be set up here. So to answer your question, no, it wouldn't be like, oh, you spent 3 years at license 1, you didn't make it to license 3, let's give you a license 2 and give you 3 more years. It really would be about incremental progress towards that. And one would not, from my understanding, one would not be required to spend all 3 years in license 1. As soon as one was able to demonstrate license 2, 3, or 4, that you could move automatically to those 3. But the issue is to set those levels appropriately for progression through to the license 4.
So these are not kind of the end all be all here. We get to add to these through this group. Okay, perfect.
So the measures themselves are not under the purview of this group,
right?
But it would be really helpful to say whatever's come up with, license 1 has to have foundational knowledge of, let's say, 5 of the 10 INTASC standards. License 2 has to have basic knowledge of all 10. License 3 has to have proficient, and license 4 has to have mastery of all 10. Something that, like, I'm just making that up. I want everyone to hear me that I'm just throwing something out there. It's totally up to y'all kind of how you build that progression. Or just recognizing that it needs to exist in a pilot, because this may, the degrees to which and the parsing of those differences maybe something that comes out in a pilot that has to be looked at in a pilot program.
Right. Thank you for that clarification, Dr. Tomlin.
This is Scott Rhodes. A quick question, and you may be able to answer this or somebody else. When we start looking at license 1, and there's the co-teacher of record by a license 4 advanced teacher. When we're talking about co-teacher, what does that model look like? Because we had some discussions in our previous subcommittee about who is going to be the teacher of record. Because, co-teaching can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different districts. Co-teaching may mean that the teacher, that license 4 teacher, is going to be in that classroom each day working with that co-teacher in a true co-teaching model. Or is it they're just going to be providing support? So any clarification on that?
Was that directed at me, Scott?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is going to sound a little glib, but that's what we need you to tell us. Like, is this, so if you think about this, a license 4, if you're thinking about these license 4 classroom excellence roles, what we're saying is these teachers might teach larger classrooms than a normal. So would you construct that with a license 4 CE and 2 license 1 teachers together so that you could have a much larger classroom and then a teaching experience being directed by that CE, and that kind of co-teaching situation would be one way to solve that for the districts. But it's also possible you could say you're going to have X number of, a license 4 or higher teacher is going to be in that teacher's classroom X amount of the time. That's the kind of question that needs to be answered.
Yeah, and Tom, what I would say in my professional opinion is that license 1 teacher, to me, would have to be the teacher of record unless it was a true co-teaching model where those 2 individuals were working collectively on a daily basis. So to have one person that would not be there consistently, and for that person to be held accountable for any of the results of the student learning, I think would provide inconsistencies. And that's where we kept kind of going back and forth again in our previous subcommittee of that license 1 teacher being the teacher of record. And so that's just a personal opinion.
Yeah, and I can tell you in conversations in that subcommittee prior to this kind of push here, there was deep concern about license 1 teachers. Nothing more than a basic understanding of teaching practices being allowed to be basically the autonomous teacher of record. So I'm not saying anything was decided in that, but that was the general issue that needs to be addressed by this.
So to Brenda's point, Brenda, I saw your question. I was saying the same thing. We already have this in terms of what we're doing right now with your residency teachers. And Scott, I know you and I have talked about the fact that you've been blessed in Henderson County to not have to use alternative licensure paths a lot, but some districts have had to use it quite a bit. So, and even some smaller districts to the east have used it more than some of our larger districts, probably, who are more wealthy or who have the ability to pay more in a local supplement. So the license 1 is to me, in my mind, just like a first-year residency teacher, someone who's got a bachelor's degree that's relevant, that's going into a classroom that's going to be associated with an EPP and taking classes, or who's on a permit to teach, or on an emergency license with 18 hours. And the intensive support, one of the things that we're going to be focusing on, I think, is what do those measures look like to make sure the support's been provided and they're progressing adequately to move to the next level of the license. So I think that if you look also when Dr. Evans created this folder for us, the presentation that has the new model and the details of the new model that Pepsi considered And that's kind of pending. That's the foundation for all of this is in that folder if you want to go and refer back to that PowerPoint presentation. That's what I've been doing quite a bit as we've been talking, and I'm sorry I don't have much voice left, but it shows on the license one of the recommendations is that there be a minimum of 5 hours where that advanced teacher is in that other teacher's classroom a week. Now, we could agree that it needs to be more than that. We could agree that it needs to be 50% of the day and that there be a coaching cycle of some sort. I think that's what we're supposed to be doing and trying to get through some of the things that we think are a given. If you look at this as an equation, where people get in and how they access this thing, how they access each level is one thing. But then once they're in, how do we take care of them? I think it's the depth of where we need. If I were going into a pilot program next year, that's what I would want more than anything else. I can figure out how to get them in the door. But once I get them in the door, what's expected of me to support them so that they could progress through this model, to see if the model is going to work, because that's ultimately the goal of the pilots. So I did have a question, and I back to Aaron's question earlier, for license C, when we're under credentials, affiliation with an EPP and PSU. If you look at license 2 in this PowerPoint, it says that there's a preparation sponsor, an EPP or PSU. And Kim, I had not caught that nuance. And Tom, I don't know if you know what that nuance is, what that means differently. If it's a and or if it's an or. Do either of you remember what the final decision was there for license 2?
If I remember correctly, we talked about, especially in the preparation and entry original work groups, that it was going to be an and, because that would be where those MOUs and those collaborative agreements together, and to Dr. Dean Dempsey's point of kind of accessing that knowledge base that happens within EPPs, of it being an and. But that's what I remember from those conversations.
Thanks.
I remember that as well. And I don't think anything has been formally approved in that regard. So we're looking to you folks to do that. I think we did. Yeah. So when we were doing this, we wrote in the and because it reflects kind of that MOU between the EPP and the PSU.
And there may still be, I mean, because to that point, there are PSUs that are approved as EPPs. And so that may be one and the same, depending on if that PSU is approved as an EPP.
Thank you. Scott, did we answer your question sufficiently, or do we need to go back to your concern about the co-teaching model?
No, Marcy, I think you did a good job answering it. You know, again, I just go back to who's responsible. The teacher of record being responsible for lesson planning, et cetera, and making sure that those lines and expectations are very clear. So, yeah, I appreciate the clarification.
And I think that certainly is part of this. I hadn't gotten that far down into duties and responsibilities of each of the two. But I would think that it would be almost like a PLT or a PLC, and they would be shared responsibilities for them to plan together, because that's how your license 1 holder is going to learn more than anything else under the supervision and coaching. So, but that's something that certainly this group can consider as an example of one of the items that we're going to be looking at going forward, the professional progression and evidence of successful practice. May be that initially that license 4 is carrying a little bit of a heavier load, but ultimately progression means that person's going to be handing off planning and with that other person. So that's a great example, Scott, to lead us into that work.
Well, and Marcy, I think I think it's really going to depend on the different levels as well. You know, from a high school and a middle school, when I put my principal hat back on, I can think of some creative scheduling, especially at the high school, where I'm using one of those licensed 4 teachers, if appropriate, not maybe teaching, 3 full classes. Maybe they've got a planning period and they're using that extra planning period in support of that, again, that licensed 1 teacher. And maybe even some of that can be done at the middle school. I know elementary would be challenging as well, but I think to your point, what we're trying to create is as much time as possible, but everyone knowing what they're responsible for.
And I agree, Scott. And I think making sure that we formalize that, because I mean, when you look at the teacher working condition survey, it's really split down the middle. The beginning teachers report that they feel they have the time within the school day to meet with their mentors and have that opportunity. And so I think us formalizing that structure within this is really important.
And I'll jump in here as a district beginning teacher mentor. I support 40 teachers across our district. And I meet with about 36 of them directly each week. I think that's important that we make sure we include that because I'm actually in a school today doing observations with BDs. And one of the things I'm concerned about is them not being able to meet with school-based mentors now. Right. So if I don't show up on a weekly basis and meet with them, they may not meet with anyone. So while we're doing this, I really want us to think about how much pressure we're putting on license 4 and if this is really going to be something we can actually do.
Yep.
All great points. I think ultimately that's part of what our pilots are going to help us figure out. I know that there have been some districts that have implemented advanced teaching roles that have had similar structure where they've been able to provide additional release time that have given them that opportunity to have almost, or teachers that have had release time and have not had a full load because they've been a co-teacher. So hopefully that's one thing we can kind of iron out, and our pilots will be able to actually figure it out for us.
I was going to lean in on the same thing. I really think we need to be clear that it's actually not tenable to think that a licensed 4 teacher who is not elevated to that leader role can go and sit in on classes and provide this kind of support. They need to be full release. This is what we know from the advanced teaching rules work. You can't just say you're running to the bathroom and hop into a class. I know I'm exaggerating, but what we found even with the districts that are doing advanced teaching roles is when they're trying to have a class, even for half the time, that they just don't have the bandwidth to support and have that team teaching experience. So I'm so glad. I'm sorry I didn't catch who was just talking a few minutes ago, but I would really like to revisit this, make sure that we're not saying in License 4, just plain License 4. The License 4 is the vast majority of teachers. This is your standard, I'm a really good teacher, I come to work every day, I deserve good pay, but I'm not going to do more work unless I get paid that $5,000 more to be the CE teacher, or up to $20,000 to be the AL teacher. I'm a good teacher, but I'm not, I don't have the time or am not given the space to leave my classroom and help other teachers. So I think we really need to be really clear in this language. I've been to many, many, many advanced roles schools. I know what it looks like when it works, and this model has to go hand in glove with advanced teaching roles and having teachers who are paid to embed in the classroom and support other teachers. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but this is so important. And if you have any questions about advanced teaching roles, we've got tons of videos. It's really hard to wrap your head around it unless you see it. But the second best is we do have a lot of videos on our website.
Thank you, Brenda. There is another subcommittee, or they're not a subcommittee. There is another working group who's actually focused on the CE and the AL level 4 teaching roles and responsibilities. So there is a group that's focused specifically on that, and will outline those kinds of things, those important things like the release time and the ability, what it looks like for those positions. So fortunately, we've got somebody focused specifically on that that's going to complement the work that this group's going to do. So Madison, you want to pick us back up where we were? And then we'll keep going. And guys, Kim did create this document. If you click on the new pathway entry, you, I believe, can add comments, leave notes and things at the end for considerations if we're not able to catch it all today. We want to catch your thoughts as best as we can so that we've got a detailed understanding of where the group's coming from and how we can move this forward.
Okay, so looking in that section 2, are there any other questions about, because I think the bulk of what we're going to kind of wanting to look at, just hearing the conversation, is going to come out of this section 3, looking at the progression and the evidence piece of things. So looking at those other licensing levels, are there any other questions as far as like license 2 to license 3, license 3 to license 4, and then Marcy said that we do have a working group that's focusing specifically on F and G, thankfully, because I think there is a lot of work that'll have to be done surrounding those. So is there any other questions about transitioning between like the license levels 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 before we move into the progression and evidence of practice? Okay, so in section 3, the professional progression and evidence of successful practice to maintain the license at that entry point. So these are going to be the requirements that the educator has to meet to stay within that license 1 or move out of it earlier than the 3 years to maintain that license 2 and meet those requirements. So with the apprentice license, to earn that license 1, the apprentice must earn their bachelor's degree and then have the 18 relevant content hours and then also be affiliated with the EPP. So what we found when we were looking at these, that a lot of the progression pieces kind of mirror the credential piece of it. So in order to progress to license 1, you have to meet the credentials that are then listed for license 1. So they kind of mirror each other a little bit there. And then also, we've already mentioned that with the license 1 specifically, you have up to 3 years, but that doesn't mean that you can't move out sooner. And so I think that's a piece to look at as well, that you don't have to sit at that license 1 or sit at that license 2 for the full 3 years. If you meet those requirements sooner, you can move on sooner rather than sitting for so many years at those license levels. So I'll just give everybody kind of a second to read through that section there. And then also another thing to point out with license levels 1, 2, and 3, they are not renewable. And then when you get into your license 4, like we just mentioned, that's going to be the bulk of our teacher population. And that one is renewable. And then it lists the tools there that are listed in the model currently as available or as an option to use to renew your license at that level 4.
Are those each bullet an or is there an and in there? So like if I have the effectiveness of 3 to 5 years, whatever tools, do I need to also have some type of professional development or micro credentials in there? Or is it just simply having the effectiveness data negate the need for 1 or 2? Or is that a question for us to discuss?
So in the model, so I was scrolling the PowerPoint just to make sure that I was the right thing. So in the model, it is, so the micro credentials and the traditional professional developments, those are an or, but then and demonstrate effectiveness. So 1 to 2 is micro-credentials approved by the PSU if they meet the standards set by the Board of Education, or traditional professional development approved by the PSU and demonstrate of effectiveness 3 to 5 years with those options that are in parentheses.
Thank you.
But that also is something that we can discuss if there are thoughts on that as well.
Hello, this is Catherine Costellos. I'm the apprenticeship director. I just want to share with you that I am on the call. I've been driving, but I've reached my destination. But if there are any questions related to the apprenticeship piece, I'm happy to answer that if I can. And I will share with the group that we have had several school districts interested in this apprenticeship, as well as the funding that we have available from federal and state grants that will help pay for some of these education expenses.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Catherine. I think the apprentice level is one that would benefit those coming in without necessarily the bachelor's degree. They're working towards those credit hours and things like that. So I think that's a beneficial tool to have in some of our counties, most of our counties.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
Can I add that with our experience in Teach NC, more than 2/3 of the 20,000 people who've signed up for Teach NC have a bachelor's degree. And traditionally, they would enter the schools as a residency. Back to Marcy's point about just sort of jumping in at the deep end, many of those people are young. They're in their 20s. They'd be willing to do an internship to not be the teacher of record, to give it a try. So, and I think that's in the best interest of students to not have an inexperienced teacher. And of course, if they choose that that's not the right profession for them, it's you haven't had a student in front of a low-performing teacher for that year because they've only been an apprentice. So I want to throw out there, I know that a lot of us are thinking how great this will be for student teachers, how great this will be for people who are trying to earn their bachelor's degree, but I will reiterate, I think this is a strong possibility. Right now, 1/3 of our candidates are coming in through residency. And I think there's a strong possibility that they might come through apprenticeship instead of coming through license 1, and then they would not be their teacher record, to the point I made earlier. So just putting that out there. I think we're undervaluing the value of this for somebody who's 24 years old, out of college, and deciding whether or not to go back. I have a degree in forensics. I have a personal example of this, and would rather be not the teacher of record.
And I think that's a great point, Brenda, because right now there isn't that option to come in and have the opportunity to try it out without actually being the teacher of record. And so providing that space in this model is really important for both the teachers and I think for the students, because we see a lot of them that come in the alternative route, and once they realize 3 to 4 months in that this isn't for them, then we have an unfilled classroom halfway through the year. Which is hard for the students and the school.
So are there questions about the apprentice license itself, as far as like the credentials for it, or how to progress through it, or progress to meet that level 1? Because it sounds like there might be a lot of interest across the counties in this apprentice level. It sounds like it's going to be something that is going to be very beneficial for some of the young college graduates, or those, working towards deciding if education is the field that they want to go in. Are there questions about that progression, or even looking back at the credentials for how to meet that apprentice level?
Yeah, I have a question. So once they're on the apprentice level, how many years is that license good for? So to move to the license 1. So if they're in that sort of apprenticeship, student teaching type experience, how many years do they have to finish their degree or move to another level?
So at the apprentice level, the license term is up to 1 year. However, it does have the ability to renew twice within 3 years. So essentially, they have up to 3 years to do that. Their contract just can't exceed 1 year at a time. So they would renew a contract every year, or they would actually reapply, is the wording in the model. They would reapply each year, and then at the end of that third year, they would have to make that decision to move into the level 1 license.
Okay, and then we're also working on finishing their degree at their institution? For example, we have applicants who didn't graduate 10 years ago. They were credit short. Would they have to then find a institution where they can finish their degree in addition to being in the apprentice license position?
So that's one of the progression pieces. So in order to progress into license 1, you do have to meet that credential of having that baccalaureate degree, or the 18 hours of relevant content. So they would have to meet those credentials in order to progress into the license 1. So if it was someone that wanted to be a social studies teacher and they had 18 hours of that history or that the history coursework, they could be affiliated with the EPP working towards finalizing that degree. But it has to be relevant coursework.
Dr. Tomberlin has his hand raised.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see Dr. Tomberlin. Go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you. Catherine, I just wanted to clarify that this is specifically an apprentice license, so nothing would preclude a teacher from strategically entering that license phase. And we're thinking about our instructional assistants. So if you were in a situation, so one could hold the non-licensed, what we call a classified position of instructional assistant while making up any educational deficits, and then wait and move into that apprentice license phase when it seems reasonable that they could complete the educational requirements within that 3-year period. So it's not like, I want to make sure we're clarifying that we're not forcing all of our instructional assistants into an apprentice licensure role. It's an either or on that one, and they could manage that's best for their situation. Does that help?
This is Catherine. Yes, I understand. And yes, it is. It's not a have to, and it's whatever the apprentice and the school or whatever y'all decide is fine. Yeah, it doesn't have to be. It is completely voluntary as far as I'm concerned.
And kind of to Allison's question earlier, Tom, when we talked about it in our original subgroups, if for some reason they can't earn the bachelor's in the 3 years that they have the opportunity to renew the apprentice license, they could go back to a classified position until they're ready to progress to a licensed one, correct? If the district wants to continue them in a classified position.
That is my understanding as well, yes. Catherine, I do want to make sure we're clear on something from the federal, so like a registered apprenticeship model. Would the funds for supporting an apprentice be tied to the apprentice license, or would there be opportunity to tie it also to that classified position?
There would be an opportunity. The only bottom line for us, the main requirement is that it is for a registered apprentice. And I say requirement on us, I'm also speaking for the grant requirements as well as the state funding that we've received. They just need to be a registered apprentice, which could be any occupation, any level, any deemed classification that you want registered. However you want that training plan to look, it can be registered, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And Well, let me just leave it at that.
All right. Thank you. That's very helpful.
For that clarification, Dr. Tomerlin, are there any other questions surrounding that apprentice license?
Yeah, I got one question. So what does that apprenticeship teacher position look like in a school? You know, like what's going to be different between that and a teacher assistant? Is it the fact that the apprentice teacher is going to be a true full-time co-teacher with a license for teacher on a daily basis? Or what would that look like in a school each day?
I'm not sure if that's a question for me, but let me just say that can be deemed by this group. You have the flexibility to determine what is that going to look like and what that will be. And then that is what we register. Does that make sense? I don't dictate that for you, in other words.
Right. Okay. I guess the perception I'm coming from is some of the prior subcommittees who had discussed some of this maybe had some input about what this might look like. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
So the way that the model is written, the apprentice just has to work under direct supervision of a licensed 4 or higher teacher. So it's kind of the same boat that license level 1 is, where that's something that we need to work to kind of make that decision as far as we discussed earlier with license level 1 not being the teacher of record. What does that teacher relationship look like? It's not specified in the model other than working under direct supervision of that license 4 or higher teacher. So that is also something in addition to that license 1 relationship that the group has the power to make that decision and kind of give those recommendations for.
Okay. You know, because I don't want to be negative, but at the same time, when I start thinking about, you know, what is that going to look like in a school on a daily basis? I can't imagine being a principal wanting to have an apprentice teacher being responsible for that daily instruction. I would love for them to be, and again, if I'm thinking about like, what is our purpose behind this model? And if our purpose is to use our very best teachers to help our very brand new folks to be successful, then that apprenticeship teacher it would have to be in a true full-time co-teaching model. The benefit to that may be that allows that licensed 4 teacher to get out more in the building to be able to help other teachers as a possibility. But I can't imagine, again, that apprentice teacher being responsible for lesson planning. And if they're not responsible for lesson planning, I can't imagine the licensed 4 teacher being responsible for that lesson planning either, because of the amount of work that it would have to put on them. So those are some of the just things that are running through my mind as we're having this discussion.
This is Catherine. Can I interject something? And I am by no means the expert here with this group, but I think it was well said earlier when it was pointed out that it would be like there was a concept of working together, because the whole idea of this apprenticeship is that this new person coming in has some hands-on activity, but they're under the guidance of, let's say, a mentor or an expert. And that way they have guidance while they're actually doing the work, so that when they're on their own and they're doing the lesson plans themselves, they're much better trained at it, as opposed to just someone graduating from college and going on in and say, okay, here, do your lesson plans. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and would not disagree. What I continue to think about is the hypothetical part of that, and then the practical part of it when we start thinking about teachers and those licensed 4 teachers and what they're already going to be responsible for. If they weren't involved in having their own load of students, then that would be much easier. Again, that's why I go back to that process. To me, it looks like if I'm the apprentice teacher and I'm only coming out with 60 hours of credit or greater, don't have a bachelor's degree, then again, I put my parent hat back on. I wouldn't want that person teaching my child in class. I would want them in a true co-teaching model where that teacher is working with that person. They're working on developing lesson plans together. They're going to PLCs together. They're learning the pedagogy part. That is great. But to have them where they're not there full time would just be cause for concern.
Yeah, Scott, thanks for clarifying what you're saying there on that particular issue. My understanding of the apprentice license and all the discussions that have been held about this is that that person is not going to be either formally in PowerSchool or practically leading a classroom unsupervised. That would not be the case. So if you want to think about the current relationship between a teacher of record and an instructional assistant now, that, you know, the teacher may leave the class with an instructional assistant for a few minutes or something, but, you know, so there's adult supervision, but there's no expectation that the IA is teaching the class in the absence of the regular teacher. And I think this is a similar model. The only difference between this and a traditional IA is there is some reciprocity in the expectations. So the apprentice is not just assisting the regular classroom teacher, but is also learning from, and there is the expectation that that licensed 4 teacher is facilitating in gaining skills in the classroom, that hands-on experience. So I want to make sure that we're clear that we're not talking about an apprentice licensed teacher leading a classroom hypothetically or practically. Unless this group feels otherwise, but I've never heard anybody suggest anything other than that.
And I think just to add on to that, when we've looked at the apprentice level, I kind of look at it similar to, you know, sort of that student-teacher, co-teacher relationship where that student-teacher comes in and they may lead a lesson or they may lead a small group, but they're not the main basis for instruction for those students. And so I think there probably will be a lot of apprentice teachers, you know, who are those IAs as well, and they've been in the school system and have relationships with some of those co-teachers they might be working with. And so with this additional responsibility of trying to complete that license to get to that license 1 or their degree to get to license 1, they may lead a small group or they may lead an SEL lesson or plan a lesson with a teacher. I think that is kind of what this apprentice goal is here, is to say to that IA, hey, do you really want to continue through this path to take on a classroom fully on your own, and give them the supports on the way to have the ability to do that. Are there any other questions or comments surrounding that apprentice license?
Hi, this is Melba Spooner. I'd just like to ask a quick question, please. Thank you so much for the clarification around the apprentice license. So I do have a question about the type of teacher, the licensing of the teacher that they would be in the classroom with. For example, would it have to be the license 4 teacher, or could it be some variation of those teachers that are working on their other license? Like the 1, 2, 3, prior to the more extensive licensure for?
It would be a license 4 teacher, or potentially one of the higher level, the CE
or AL. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
License 4. Mm-hmm. Anything else surrounding that apprentice? License. Okay, so to just keep on moving through here, like we discussed, license 1, 2, and 3, they're non-renewable. You have the up to 3 years in 1 and up to 3 years in 2, and then up to 3 years in the license level 3. Questions about those? All right, and then looking at the license level 4, this is where we bring in that renewable piece. And so we talked about you having the micro credentials or the traditional professional development, and then the is that Roman numeral 3 there, the point there where we're demonstrating effectiveness of 3 of those 5 of the 5 years for 3 of them, and then the tools there. So looking at EVOS, tools designated or tools designated to measure impact on student learning, peer review, practice, or other reliable and valid quantitative or qualitative methods that have not yet been developed. So I think there's probably lots of conversation on that. So let's look at that point as we're moving through this, because I know we had a question or two earlier surrounding the means of renewal, or how we're going to measure that piece of renewal. And Dr. Holland did point out in the Google tool as well that there is a working group that is working on the student impact piece of that. So there is being discussed in a working group on its own, student learning and peer collegial review. All right, as we get into F, because I guess, are there any other questions about the license level 4 comments that we want to add? Okay, so item F, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't hit my unmute button fast enough.
It's okay.
Because I do see the national board certification can be accepted towards renewal. And so now that national boards is on a 5-year cycle, is that something that as long as they continue to renew national boards, they can continue? Wait, did I jump to CE? I may have jumped to CE. I scrolled down.
Yeah, I think you're in the C, but we were moving there anyways because there wasn't any questions coming up for the license board.
Sorry.
You're okay.
Well, I think it's good to note that the initial national board process could be part of license 4 as a renewal tool if the PSU and or EPP agree with that.
EPPs are out of it, essentially.
Well, under license 4, it says traditional professional development approved by the PSU, EPP, or partnership.
Sure.
So national board, I mean, if you look at this, the progression, you could potentially have somebody with 15 years under their belt if they took every year at every license level before they get to license 4.
Yeah.
They're well ready for national board by that point if your district is doing what they're supposed to be doing and preparing them. And they've progressed through this model that way. So it would make sense. I just don't know that I don't think we need to spell it out. But Aaron, I think you're right on target there that the initial national board could certainly be one of those things in license 4. And then the renewals go into CE and AL. Sorry.
I think that's a great point as well. That would also, I think, be an effective way to measure that renewal at level 4. Okay, so the license with the 4 CE, which is item F underneath number 3. So it's a license term of 5 years. And again, it is renewable. And then the renewal tools are, you've got the 5 there. The one we were just discussing was the national board. But this also includes coursework for a master's degree can be accepted towards the renewal as well. In addition to this, you've got exceeding growth and EVOS, 3 out of the 5, those 3 out of 5 years. If I'm assuming he's meaning for that to say 3 out of 5 years, correct, Dr. Evans?
That's right.
Okay. If it's available for that content, for that whatever that educator teaches, and then using. Oh, okay. And then this item 5 just kind of gives that other, reliable or valid methods can be identified or developed, which kind of leaves the door, open there. So questions. Erin, did you get out your full thought about the national board there?
Well, yeah. So the first one being national board, since that's on a 5-year renewal cycle now, could I essentially use national board renewal as long as I maintained it as my option for renewing my license for CE? And then also kind of similar to my question under E, which of these are ands and which of these are ors? Like, do I have to have the exceeding growth and EVOS 3 out of 5 if available, or national board, or is it an and? Because before we said it was the PD, either micro-credentials or PD, and effectiveness.
Let me find the slide on the PowerPoint just to make sure this is AO. So for CE, it says, Dr. Tomberlin, do you know if those are ands or? I don't see them on the model.
Around the renewal options?
Yes. Are they like and exceeding growth if available or?
That is entirely up to this group. These are the tools that have been recognized. You can think about, should you have one of these, and which ones that you would recommend in the pilot? Should you have 2, 3, whatever? That's and again, you're recommending for the pilot, you're not saying this is absolutely the way this has to be. So if you wanted to say, sure, all 5 of those, and you need 2 in the pilot, that could be something you recommend, or all these are available and you need 1 of them. We just need you to determine what what should be conducted, how it should be conducted in the pilot.
Okay. I think it would be important, and everyone else can chime in on this, to keep it consistent across the renewal levels. So if the license 4 is saying micro-credentials or a professional developed and demonstrate effectiveness, I would think it would be important to keep that consistent in terms of some sort of professional development option and some sort of demonstration of effectiveness. The only one that gets kind of iffy with is when we start looking at, are we pulling these teachers out of the classroom to do these positions, or are we keeping these teachers in the classroom? It's going to be more challenging if the idea here is to pull them out for those teachers to necessarily show growth if they're not teacher of record or working directly with their own classroom anymore.
Yep. I think that's a good point, Madison. And then just as a point of clarification and formatting, it looks like under F, bullet 1 is actually just an introduction, that there's really only 4 items there.
Yes, I noticed that while Dr. Tomlin was talking also. Dr.
Yeah, need to be indented.
It looks like it's just indented too many times.
Yep.
Right. So there are just the 4, the exceeding growth, the alternate tools, and then the national board or masters. I think the other thing that might be important to distinguish in here is we just have it listed, no coursework for a master's degree. Do we put a number of credit hours on that? Do we put, with our previous licenses, we've got 18 hours, which 18 hours in a master's program is, a little bit more extensive than an undergraduate program. But do we put a number on that as well? That's another question, something else that we need to think about. Do we make that specific? And then that number 4, I think number 4 needs to be kept. It's just that it's that open door that gives the districts a little bit of leeway to decide this teacher really demonstrated through this versus this.
So one of the questions I have is, once I reach that, if I meet the criteria to be a licensed 4 teacher, then I'm up for renewal 5 years later, can I move backwards to a license 3 if I'm not meeting this criteria? Or once I'm a level 4, I'm always at a license 4?
I think the discussions that were had in the subcommittees around that issue, Scott, were that you could have one unsuccessful renewal, like you met the professional learning requirements, but you could not meet the effectiveness requirements, that you could continue you would be renewed for another 5 years. And then you would have to meet that the second time, or the license would expire. So basically 5 years successful, every 5 years a successful demonstration, or if you can't exhibit it in one renewal cycle, the effectiveness in one renewal cycle, you would have another opportunity to do that. But then the license would be in jeopardy after the 10th year.
But that's only for the plain license 4, right? Like I can go from a license 4 AL or CE down to a license 4 if I still meet those requirements. I just can't go back to a license 3, correct?
Correct.
Right. So I can hop between AL, CE, and just a plain license 4 as long as I'm still meeting the requirements for the basic license 4, even though I may not be exceeding growth.
That's right.
Because I'm still demonstrating some effectiveness, maybe just not exceeding effectiveness.
Okay, so are there any other opinions or comments within those 4 renewal tools for that license level CE? And one of the things, and Dr. Tomerlin hinted at this too, is that we are making these decisions for the purpose of the pilot. And so we want to make sure that we're allowing the districts that do pilot it to have a little bit of leniency, a little bit of movement, so that we can really dial in on those pilot counties, what worked and what didn't work, and what do they need more specific, or what does the model need more specifics on that maybe were too general moving into the pilot. So with those tools, are there any other comments or questions there? All right, so moving into the AL license, which is the Advanced Teacher Adult Leadership license, or piece of it. The CE, remember, just a reminder, was the classroom excellence piece. This one is a license term of 5 years. Again, it is renewable. And so like we just discussed, you are able to bounce kind of between the 2 or the 3, including the license level 4. And again, we have the renewal tools here. So exceeding growth and EVOS, if it's available. Tools designated are designed to measure impact on student learning and peer review practice. Again, we do have a working group working specifically on that piece of things. And then the national board and coursework for master's degree can be accepted towards renewal. So essentially the 4CE and the 4AL have the same requirements for renewal. Any questions on either of those or comments? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so I don't know if the national board certification or coursework for math, like, I think we might want to be specific here as a way of demonstrating adult leadership, because I think, that's one of the things that we find around the research around coaching, that just because somebody's a great classroom teacher doesn't necessarily mean they're a great mentor or an adult educator. And so I'm not sure that national board certification would necessarily fit here, simply because it's more about the work that you're doing, other than being, there is the leadership component, but not necessarily being a leader with adults. It's about being a leader within your school. And so I would like to see if we could maybe flesh out a couple more options here for adult leadership and about ways teachers can demonstrate working with adult learners versus kind of these similar things for classroom excellence.
So when we're just throwing out there, like with the master's coursework being specific in like curriculum and instruction or leadership within the schools versus being like general, like more of the coaching aspect of it versus the classroom teacher aspect.
Yeah. Because because there's definitely a different body of research around working with adult learners versus working with elementary or adolescents, right? So I think if we could be a little bit more specific, because I don't know that I could say that if you did coursework for a master's degree that counted for classroom excellence, that would be the same coursework that would count for adult leadership.
If I could weigh in on this is Brenda Berg. I agree completely that being a good leader and having a measure of it, what we found in the districts, there are 19 districts doing ATR right now, is that each kind of has their own approach, even into effectiveness, but they've really gone toward more rigor instead of less, because of course they want these folks to be super successful, and the teachers they're working with have to appreciate them, right? There has to be, if not, they sort of get demoted, right? And we've all, at least in the private sector, we've all seen the Peter principle, right? You rise to the highest level of incompetence. And so it's okay if somebody comes in and then it turns out they're not that great of an adult leader, but it's really hard to measure it until you've actually given them that opportunity. You can put them in that kind of, that other ATR kind of category and give them a few responsibilities, and there's certainly other ways to demonstrate leadership, but each district is, I think, doing a fantastic job of figuring out what works within their community, within their teaching community. So I agree wholeheartedly we need to emphasize leadership, but I think the districts are, valuing it because the credibility of these roles requires it. So I just throw that out there based on what we've been seeing in the ATR districts.
And Brenda, to that point, maybe some of that evidence is demonstrated while they're mentoring in classroom excellence or a level 4 of working with beginning teachers, right? Some of those apprentice or level 2 teachers, like you said, they can't demonstrate till they have a chance to do it. So what are some ways that we can use some of the previous license levels to give them opportunities to demonstrate it? Yep.
Okay.
I'll just underscore, because I was trying to type it out, that the access to beginning teachers varies a lot from school to school. So even just something that simple, like if you look at the heat map of fully licensed teachers, we have districts that are 49% not fully licensed teachers, and we have others that are like zero, not zero, but the 5%, right? So again, district to district, what opportunities people have to demonstrate leadership just varies. So wholeheartedly agree. And maybe as we move through this, there are things about ATR that I find that we need to be more and more prescriptive about, and other things that I feel really, really comfortable that the districts are doing just really, really well on their own. And this happens to be one of them.
Okay, so around that idea of looking at different types of coursework and the adult leadership piece of it versus the classroom piece, are there any other comments or questions surrounding that? Okay, so we've got parts 4, 4, 5, and 6 left here, but I just want to make sure. So what we're essentially going to do here is we'll take all of our notes and the comments and the questions and things like that, and we will make amendments and adjustments to this document. So when we come back together for our next working group meeting, we're looking at those things. So I want to make sure that if there is anything else in that section 2 or section 3, because they are kind of big chunks of this work that we're doing today, that there's not anything else that you feel like we've missed or not addressed between those two, the credentials and the progression piece of it, before we move on. We've had a lot of good conversation, and so I just want to make sure that no one was missed in that process. All right, then. So the next piece of it is evidence of successful practice necessary to progress to a different license status, meets the requirements of the next license level as we set forth above. So an example of this one is in order to earn the license level 1, you have to add an apprentice license holder must earn their bachelor's degree and have the relevant content hours. So this one, again, is a little bit repetitive, but we're looking more specifically at the evidence, so the requirements to get to that next level.
I will say, for me personally, I think it's difficult to be able to talk about that evidence, especially in the earlier licenses, until we know what those tools that the other subcommittee is going to suggest. So, for example, I know we talked earlier, like everything needs to be tied back to NTASC, but what tool is going to be used to determine that? Or are we saying, or is this Dr. Tomlin's point earlier, when we need to say like a basic level of all 10 NTASC standards to be at level 2, and then a proficient level at level 3? Like how can we do this without necessarily knowing what those tools are that the other group's going to recommend?
I think that's a good point. And I think what we might need to do within our working group is look at it, I guess, in the perspective of how it falls in looking specifically at like the entry points and maybe how it applies to us. And then once we kind of get all of our thoughts together, and I think some of it too is a tad bit repetitive, as far as like, we talked earlier about the progression is really the credentials for, the license level and things like that. And I think all we can really do, I guess, is discuss it in terms of what we've already seen, like what we've noticed here. Because you're right, if they change something or make an amendment, we don't know that yet. And that's something that we'll get some of. Dr. Evans, will we be able to see some of the other work that's done in the other working groups that pertain to our group between our meeting and our next one in February?
So the professional learning document, I will check with those co-chairs about sharing. But that's something that I can definitely share. And then the compensation matrix, that's on the slides that are in that folder. So then I could add that professional learning document in that folder.
Okay. I think that would be helpful. That way we can see where some of the other groups are at as far as it pertains to the topics that we've been discussing today.
Sure.
I would like to see us include in here, and y'all tell me if I'm way off base. As far as successful practice, I think there needs to be some, it's kind of a crazy way to say it, some credit given or weight given to an administrator evaluation. Administrators are the vast majority of administrators. Everybody can say that there's always a bad apple somewhere, but administrators work hard to make sure that they're in their classrooms and observing their teachers and that they're providing feedback and support. And they really do a good job when there are needs that need to be met of addressing those. But they too, like others, it's as Stephen alluded to earlier, the mentors don't have a lot of time, neither do administrators, but they do a good job. And there is a tool that's out there that's designed to focus on educator growth, professional growth. So I think that we need to include that as part of our measure here.
Is that tool, Dr. Holland, the NESIS, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that one. And I know that they're working on revisions to the administrator tool that very possibly could lead to down the road. And even this work could lead to down the road improvements on the teacher tool. So just thoughts around that. I think we need to give weight to that because there's a lot of work that's going into that, a lot of research upon which all that is being built.
And Marcy, I would agree with you 100%. I do think that needs to be part of the process. The only feedback that I would give is I think there needs to be maybe for us in our districts, maybe an opportunity to go back and improve our expectations so that we have greater inter-rater reliability. Because I know that a lot of times that does not exist, and what accomplished or proficient is in one school is not in the other school, which again, I think we're always going to have a difficult time. And I think this is going to be the most challenging part of this work is trying to find an effective way to keep score. And how do we do that with consistency so that folks don't feel like they're being left out or deserve something that they're not getting. But I do believe as principals, the way that we hold them accountable is, the results of their schools, part of their pay is being determined on the growth of their school. And so there's a reason for them to make sure that they're in those classrooms and they're helping those teachers, that they're hiring great teachers and they're helping the ones they have improve. And I think that's why I would agree it has to be a part of it.
And I think it bears highlighting Brenda's comment in the chat about also thinking about the administrative role and principals that have 100 plus teachers in their building, right? And being able to do all of those, like also providing them the time and space to be able to provide that feedback and, to Scott's point, being that instructional leader for them. Is important.
So this is Tom. I think the language tools designed to measure impact on student learning / peer collegial review practice is I don't think in any of the discussions related to some kind of observational component on this, I think everyone agrees is important. I think the concern is can principals do it at the level we're talking about? And I agree, Marcy, when there are issues that need to be addressed, principals are really good. But we're not just talking about the identification of a problem of practice. we're talking about some real nuanced. These are the little things that you may not, that you could improve, that could lead you to a higher level of licensure and compensation, which I think is a much bigger task. And I think one of the ways that was recommended to go about solving this is, can you have some kind of 360 type evaluation where the principal certainly is a part of that, but also the advanced teacher who may be in that class, who by definition is going to be in that classroom with those lower level licensed teachers a few hours a week, not a few hours a year. And then, of course, the other recommendation was, can we get student perspective built into this, who are in that class 180 days out of the year and are seeing what's happening. Now, that one I understand is a little trickier about how you frame those questions. But I think the idea was to develop a much more robust process that may be less vulnerable to individual biases than we've seen with our current operation. But I don't recall hearing any conversation where we were not wanting the principal to be a part of something. We were some kind of subjective assessment of the teacher's skills.
And Tom, if I would just add one part to that, I would be really hesitant to ask any of our licensed 4 teachers to play any evaluative role with those folks. And here's the only reason why. We're trying to build trust with them. And if it feels like, as that licensed 4 teacher, if am I part of that process of evaluating you, which may determine whether or not you move up the scale in compensation, then I'm afraid that could create issues that would hinder the growth of that relationship between those 2 individuals.
I hear that, and I'm not saying I disagree with it. What I'm wondering is, could we test that conventional wisdom in a pilot to see if that is in fact what's going to happen, or would it yield to teachers having? I mean, I could see it both ways. Do you want critical feedback from somebody who sees you day in and day out? Is that feedback more reliable and more welcome than someone who's seeing you 3, maybe 4 times a year? I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't know of any really strong research that's been done in that area. I think there's some conventional wisdom that you can't simultaneously coach somebody and be evaluative. Well, I watched Dean Smith and Mike Krzyzewski do it successfully for years and years. Why can't our teachers do that? But I don't know. I'm saying that this is a question that could be examined in a pilot program.
And Scott, just to add to that, I think there's a lot, I see a lot to what you're saying, being in the classroom and having that mentor role. It would be hard to receive criticizing feedback, potentially, whether it's constructive or not, from someone, you're right, that you're working in that classroom with. And I think in the district I was in previously, your mentor was not who did your observation or your peer observation. I'm sure many districts are like that. And so I think it could be something ultimately down the road when we get into like the very specific wording, that maybe the mentor doesn't do the observation and it's someone that's coming in that maybe has only seen you 3 or 4 times. Because I think what we also tend to see is student teachers tend to sometimes, or apprentice teachers, beginning teachers, tend to sometimes pick up things that their mentors are doing, and they do a lot of similar things. I know when I was a BT, I would go in and observe my mentor, and I would come back to my classroom and do some of the same classroom management things that she was doing because that's what I was seeing. And I almost think it might be harder for a mentor to tell their mentee that they're doing something that might not be as effective if they're also doing the same thing. So just to kind of throw that out there as well.
I appreciate that perspective. And Tom, I agree with you. I mean, this could be done in a pilot. Could totally see that. But I think, if I were to throw anything out there that I would consider a win-win, I believe in our district, anyone who's going to serve in that role has to be willing to give people feedback, whether it both be good or bad, because no one's ever going to improve unless someone is capable of being able to coach them and give them that feedback. While at the same time, giving them feedback in that way is different than giving them the feedback and also being the person that is doing the evaluation. To me, if I'm the principal, I want that mentor's input as I'm going through and doing the evaluation. Because you're right, Tom, if I'm only going to be in there 1 hour and I'm going to do that 3-4 times a year, am I really seeing what I need to? Well, I can tell you, we expect principals in classrooms, weekly, daily. But still, is it going to be better than what that licensed 4 teachers who's in there a lot of the times being able to give us that input? And so that would be the only thing I would say. And again, to your point, Tom, I think it could be done in a pilot and just see how it goes.
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. I think there's something very distinctly different between being a coach and being a peer observer evaluator. And so the coaching model, when it's used correctly and well, the relationship is there. And when the person is not performing well or not meeting the expectation in that coaching cycle, there's not any surprises. And so that relationship's already going to be there when they're set up as the coach. So I'm interested to see how that does work in a pilot, because for years we've not wanted mentors who have relationships to be observers and part of the evaluation process out of concern that that's going to change the relationship. But it may make, on the flip side, it may make that relationship stronger if it's authentic feedback and coaching more so than the evaluation piece. So.
Hey, this is Tom again. I just want to go on record as saying I have no idea. That's why I think it could be a really interesting part of this pilot to see if that relationship is affected either positively or negatively by the introduction of some formalized feedback. And it's not really clear to me that I'm thinking it's like Nisus as much as some other way we could construct it so it doesn't feel like the formal evaluation process that may be used for other HR purposes.
All right, are there any other, there's someone in the chat.
Sorry, I could just say what I was saying. Tom and I had this conversation. When we visit advanced teaching roles districts and this issue comes up, there's just, this is a big move, right? To go from a world where having an adult in your room is punitive to one where it should be embraced and it's team teaching and it's collaborative, and it's a big shift. And so these new lead teachers, it takes a year or two to really truly build trust, and then to say, oh, I'm also doing your evaluation, is a bridge too far in these early stages. To Tom's point, perhaps later, but I would hesitate to put it in now because we know that right now in most schools it is a one teacher, one classroom model. And first they need to get to this level of, hey, look, we can actually work together and be a team. I'm not saying teachers aren't collaborative at all. Please understand what I'm talking about, where you actually have, the teachers and the students all kind of more floating and having that lead teacher involved. So I would say today, while districts are still phasing into ATR, I would hesitate to have a license for lead teacher do evaluations.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Are there any other comments in regards to Brenda's comment there? Okay. The fifth point here talks about the supports necessary for a person to engage in successful professional progression. This is where we talked about there's a document coming from hopefully another subcommittee to kind of address some of these things. But are there any comments or questions kind of looking at this topic here, the fifth one? Okay, and I think this fifth point here, we're looking specifically at what supports do we need for each of these educators within each of these levels. So what supports does that license one teacher need to get to license two? We talked a little bit about looking at that co-teacher relationship and kind of identifying what that relationship looks like. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but I just want to make sure there weren't any other comments there. All right, and that brings us to our last point, which is the compensation piece of our work group. Subcommittees, or the finance subcommittee worked to put together the compensation matrix that is in the model. Essentially, each license level has a starting point of a base salary, and then license levels 3 through 4 offer additional steps in that compensation. And then there is the stipend for the classroom excellence and adult leadership advanced teacher roles that are in there as well. And so I know that the subcommittee that worked on that prior to these working groups being formed, they spent a lot of time looking at the numbers and kind of pulling together the math and whatnot to get those numbers for that model. So does anyone want to see that? Are there any questions or comments in regards to the additional compensation for the CE or the AL or the steps through levels 3 and 4? I believe it's on slide, it says on there, slides 20 and 22 of the document. I think it's in it should be in the Google folder.
I will say I do appreciate the proposed schedule, including both master's and national boards pay for those higher level licenses. Is that an option though for license 3? As well, because we do have some students who do a master's program, and I could put that on the document, I guess, as a question.
I think that's a good question. As far as I know, I don't know, it might have been discussed in that subgroup or that finance group prior to the current model that we have. Dr. Tomberlin, do you know if that was discussed within that subcommittee, if there was any reason for starting it just at level 4?
I don't recall off the top of my head. We can get you that information. I don't want to misspeak on this one.
Sorry, Madison. I was actually on that subcommittee. There was a lot of discussion about it. And there, I believe, was a recommendation that it be considered. But through some of the work and recognizing the difficulty that we've had getting master's pay restored regardless, it was, I don't want to say it was a negotiation because I don't feel like it was a negotiation. Don't take it that way. But I think the intent here is really recognizing the difference in the level of licenses that are here and what's being expected of and done through this process, and seeking restoration. Sorry. That's what you get for trying to be too many things to too many people at once. The phone doesn't stop ringing or beeping at you. I think that's where we landed with where we could get some synergy around Masters and National Board at level 4 and above. If you look at it in terms of a hierarchy of licenses, and I try not to do that too. I'll talk about one being below or above the other, but you get where I'm coming from there.
And just to add to that, like we talked about earlier, you're not required to sit in license 3 for those full 6 years. So if you finish license, if you meet those requirements for a level 4 in the second year of your license level 3, and you move up because you do have and you have your master's, you would then be eligible for that license 4, because it's not specified to I'm gonna double check. It's not specified to the CE or the AL licenses. It's just license 4 in general. So if you moved out of 3 quicker, and someone with their master's, I'm just thinking out loud, would probably move into level 4 pretty quickly. Someone that's working on or has their master's. Were there any other comments or any? Oh, is there? Oh, okay. So Brenda's just adding that the research is there to support the national board piece of it. Any other comments, questions surrounding the compensation, the matrix that's in the model, or the conversation we've had surrounding license 3? Or the stipend piece for the CE and the AL?
So I feel like there are a couple of things, and I would love for some folks to consider. One is the CTE. For those of you who currently understand and work with CTE licensure, we've got CTE specific in one of the earlier licenses. I can't remember if it's apprentice or license 1. But there are some current CTE teachers that come in without a degree who could get 20 or 25 or 30 years of experience and start that high on the teacher salary schedule, because this is truly a second career for them, and they get all of their experience credit. If they're without a degree, they're never going to get to that license 4 where they can get all of those years. I'm just wondering if there's any thought around that. And we only have a few minutes left in our meeting today, so that's probably something we need to put as a question for next time. And if everybody can kind of think about that. Our friends in CTE, a couple of them have reached out to me to say, what does that mean for these folks? And I've just explained that we don't have a clear answer yet. Again, it might be something that gets worked out on a pilot. The second thing that we need to make sure that we include in this is where we would have an entry point for our international faculty. A lot of the districts in the state, there are 3 primary sponsors for cultural exchange teachers, and they currently come in basically with an initial license, and they stay on that initial license, which would equate to like our level 4, or a level 4 license. We need to make sure that we're addressing them in this model as well as one of our entries. And I don't I didn't bring that up earlier because I didn't want to detract from the work today, but that's something that I think we do need to tackle in our recommendation again at our next meeting. So thank you for letting me kind of get your thoughts going around those two groups as well.
And Brenna just pointed out in the chat also out of state, people coming in from out of state where they would enter at, as well as, you know, even a smaller subgroup looking at like military spouses and those that move around the state more frequently than others, or the country, I'm sorry, not the state. Okay, we are coming down to the final minutes of our of this first session. And so I just want to make sure that if you had any comments or concerns, that you did add those into the Google chat. If you feel like something was not addressed and maybe needs to be looked at again as we move into our next meeting, if you'll add that to that Google Doc. There's a lot of us in here. I think we've had some really good conversations surrounding these pilots and some of the changes and recommendations that need to be made in order for these pilots to, you know, be hopefully successful and kind of help us continue to work through these models and moving forward with them. So with that being said, are there any final remarks on this framework that we've been looking at to add to the list for us to look at as we move into our February meeting? Okay. Well, I guess the final thing, so from here, what we'll do is Dr. Holland and Dr. Evans and myself, and we will kind of sit down and take all of the recommendations, the conversations we've had. We'll look at those comments and we'll make some amendments to this framework and add some things to it based on conversation. And as we move into February, our goal for our February meeting will be to finalize these recommendations in order to take them back to the commission so that we can continue to move forward with the timeline and sort of our progression with this model. Dr. Holland, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we close out?
Just want to say thank you, Madison, for taking the heavy lift today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts that come up, please feel free to add those to that Google Doc so that we can kind of address them as we move forward into our February meeting. And again, I just want to say I appreciate the input and conversation that we've had today.
Thank you both.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again in February.
Thank you.